A few weeks ago, my colleague Laura Hood and I went out onto the streets of central London here in the UK to ask some people one question. Here's Laura.
What class do you consider yourself to be?
It's a tricky business, asking a British person what their class is.
Middle class.
Working class.
Working class.
Working class.
Middle class.
It can make them uncomfortable.
Don't ask me.
So it's super simple. What class do you identify as?
Working class.
And can you tell us a bit more about why you feel that way?
Just my upbringing. Yeah, mainly just my upbringing.
Okay,
family.
wonderful.
It can even make them a tad defensive.
And would you be willing to answer?
Yeah.
Okay, what class do you identify as?
I don't identify no class whatsoever.
class whatsoever?
I think the whole thing's a fiction.
It does, however, always trigger an interesting response.
I would say in terms of the privilege I have, I would say middle class, but I'd identify as working class from my views and standpoints.
Okay, interesting.
Class is still very much part of life in Britain, but it's become a much more slippery concept than it used to be. For most of the 20th century, if you did a manual job, you were working class. If you bossed people around, you were middle class. And your class influenced the way you voted. If you were working class, you voted for the Labour Party. If you were middle or upper class, you voted Conservative. But that's no longer true. And in a new series for The Conversation, our senior politics editor in London, Laura Hood, has been finding out why and what it means for the future. We're running the first episode of that series today. It's called Know Your Place, What Happened to Class in British Politics, and it's from our sister podcast, The Conversation Documentaries. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Hi, Laura. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Gemma.
So, Laura, most countries have kind of a class system, right? But here in Britain, we seem particularly obsessed with ours. Why is that? And how much does class still influence everything about daily life here?
Well, this is such a curious question and kind of why we wanted to do this podcast, because in fact, the British class system is nowhere near as rigid as it used to be and how other countries kind of conceive of us. But British people do still think of everything in class terms, and they have a really strong sense of their own class identity. But when it comes to other people's class identity, things get a little bit more confused.
You've been thinking a lot about the way this class system interacts with politics in Britain. What made you start thinking about that?
So a few years ago, I worked with John Curtis, who's a very famous political scientist, on an article in which he revealed that in 2019, something happened in British politics. The relationship between class and politics was broken. That was the election year in which you could no longer predict how someone would vote according to their social class. And I wanted to explore what had happened to that energy. We still have this class energy in our lives, right? Can it really just have exited from the political arena? I didn't believe that it could. And I wanted to find out where it's gone.
And is there something particular about this moment as well that made you want to do it now?
So we've just come out of an election in which we elected a working class prime minister for the first time in a really long time. Keir Starmer made a really big deal of his working class heritage on the election campaign, was always reminding us that his dad was a toolmaker. So I think it's a very interesting moment for class and politics in the UK. Are we going to see Starmer's party appealing once again to working class voters? Why doesn't that party appeal to working class voters anymore? And where did that relationship break?
Great. And we're going to hear the first episode of this new series that you've been working on called Know Your Place, What Happened to Class in British Politics. And it's supported, we should say, from a generous grant from the UK's National Centre for Social Research. So thanks to them. Before we get into the episode, where can people hear it?
You can go to the Conversation Documentaries podcast channel and subscribe there. We've got episodes coming every Monday during October.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Laura.
Thanks.
And now we're going to jump straight into the episode.
Platform 1 for the 1521 Great Western Railway service to Oxford, which is ready to leave.
There's probably no better place to talk about class than the University of Oxford, where the UK's elites have been educated for centuries.
This is Oxford.
That's where my producer Anouk and I met Geoffrey Evans.
Hi, Jeffrey, I'm Laura. Good to meet you.
He's a professor of sociology and author of The New Politics of Class, the political exclusion of the British working class.
Oh wow, that's your collection.
Yeah, I used to work in the pottery industry in Stoke, and actually one or two of the factories I worked in are here, but obviously this is all stuff from 1930 or thereabouts. It's all like Art Deco.
The first thing you notice when you enter Geoffrey's office is an incredible display of pottery. Dozens of teapots, milk jugs and coffee cups adorn shelves around his desk. And as you can hear, I was taken aback by how beautiful it was.
What were you doing for them?
Oh, I mixing slip in the slip house, which means you get all the silica, which is really bad for you actually. I've still got marks on my lungs from it, and mix it with the various clay. It's in liquid form, so right at the very start of the process.
Right.
That's what I mainly did. I was 16 when I started there actually, but it's a different world. All gone now. I mean, one of those like left behind post-industrial grim places. It's kind of sad to see how it's changed.
So you're from Stoke originally?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Right now, So
Geoffrey is an Oxford professor, but he also left school at 15, worked very manual jobs in factories, and only went to university in his mid-20s. He's been researching politics and class for decades, investigating class identities.
Even now, a lot of people, if you push them, will identify as working class because they come from, say, a working class background. I think identity has not changed as much as people thought. In some countries it has, but in Britain we are more entrenched in this view that many people, even people with what we think of as objectively middle class jobs, still feel working class when pushed.
The decline of industry in the UK means that traditional working class jobs are a smaller part of the economy than they were in, say, the 1980s. More and more of us are working in offices or as managers. More of us are going to university than in the past. Yet, more people still identify as working class than middle class.
A lot of the sort of middle class types of jobs are not that great, and the university qualifications don't get you that wonderful a life. Whereas you go to university in 1980, and I went in the 80s, it was like, wow, what am I doing here? It's like a very different world. I met middle class people, and it was like a very different world. But now, loads of people go to universities all around the country, and they come out of it, and I don't think they feel like they're a member of a privileged upper middle class elite anymore.
Absolutely not. The National Centre for Social Research found in 2023 that 77% of people still believe that social class affects a person's life opportunities, either a great deal or quite a lot. In fact, more people think that this is the case than in the 1980s, a time when the class structure was far more overt. I put this to Tim Bale, who I often bother when I need help understanding British politics. He's a professor at Queen Mary University of London. This whole project has been a sort of eye-opener in terms of how the way the British feel class, just like within us, there are certain things that we don't need to say. And a lot of people would like to think that class is a thing of the past, but we carry it with us in our every interaction.
Yeah, I mean, clearly class is not a thing of the past. And you also now have this, in some ways, counterintuitive development of middle class people reclaiming their working class heritage in a way. You know, people suggesting that somehow they're working class because their grandfather did a manual job, even though actually, you know, their parents went to university and so did they, and they're in fairly middle class occupations. So I don't think we can completely dismiss class from any consideration of politics, even if we say that it's now quite difficult to predict, as it were, someone's vote from their class position.
But so why do you think that people want to claim working class status?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really difficult one. I mean, I can, feel it in myself, I think sometimes, but it would be ridiculous of me to call myself working class because my dad was a university lecturer and my mum was a teacher, and the fact that, okay, my dad's dad worked in an aircraft factory. I mean, how relevant is that? But a lot of people will do that. Yeah.
Many of us are working in what were once thought of as elite jobs, but are unable to get on the housing ladder. Some of us are becoming millionaires off the back of manual jobs. Lots of us are ostensibly self-employed, but are really working as wage slaves to gig economy algorithms. We have grandparents who worked in manufacturing, or as in my own case, in coal mines, but just 2 generations later might find ourselves on the receiving end of a jibe about the metropolitan elite. Or is that just me? If you think that class is still easy to describe, let me ask you, is Victoria Beckham wrong to describe herself as from a working class family?
Yeah, I mean, I think also we both come from families that work really hard. Both of our parents work really hard. We're very working class.
Be honest.
I am being honest.
What car did your dad drive you to school in?
Okay, in the 80s, my dad had a Rolls Royce.
Thank you.
This clip is from the couple's recent Netflix documentary, Beckham. And after all, Posh Spice's dad was a working-class North Londoner. He made a fortune after creating his own electrical wholesale business, and he drove around with a white van alongside his Rolls Royce. So, when does a person stop being one class and start being another?
I'm an Oxford professor. I go back to Stoke every week. However, I keep quiet about my life down here because it's just too damn privileged. And
right.
Although I've got very strong memories of what it's like working in the factories and that, it's a long time ago now.
In 1967, legendary political scientist Peter Polzer wrote, "Class is the basis of British party politics. All else is embellishment and detail." And when I sat down with John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and Senior Research Fellow at the National Centre for Social Research, he mentioned Polzer's quote straight away.
And essentially the point was that it wasn't a one-to-one relationship, but that people who were in working class jobs, so people who essentially were engaged in manual work, they were doing what they were told to do and they were essentially manual jobs. They tended to vote Labour, which of course was founded at the beginning of the 20th century in order to provide representation for working class people. Conversely, middle class people in reasonably, usually well-paid professional or managerial jobs, together with people who are self-employed, which is always an important part of the Conservative coalition, that they were more likely to vote Conservative. Labour folk at the end of the day were more concerned about inequality. More middle-class folk were more concerned about growing the pie, having incentives for business to be able to grow the economy, etc., etc. And so that, divide was an important divide.
Of course, it's never that simple.
One thing that was always true even back in the 1950s and 1960s, given that then the working class were more numerous than the middle class, the Conservative Party was only able to win elections by having some success at appealing to working class voters. But equally now, as the occupational structure was changing and we were becoming a majority middle class society as opposed to a majority working class society, so Labour had to think a little bit about, how do we expand our class base?
The Labour Party has continued to grapple with this question into the 21st century too. But for the most part, that underlying pattern stood. Working class people voted Labour and middle class people voted Conservative. Until 2019.
I've just been to see Her Majesty the Queen earlier on, and she agreed to dissolve Parliament.
It was strange and confusing in many ways. That was the year that Prime Minister Boris Johnson hid in a fridge to get away from journalists.
I'll be with you in a second.
Right, he's been taken inside, into the freezer.
He's gone into the fridge.
And do you remember that incident when he snatched a reporter's phone to avoid a difficult question?
You refuse to look at the photo. You've taken my phone, put it in your pocket, Prime Minister.
It was a weird time. But the most striking and significant feature of the 2019 election was the fall of the Red Wall.
Blythe Valley in Northumberland, election night's first shock result. When this seat turned blue, the die was cast. Boris Johnson wasn't just going to take Labour's Red Wall, he was going to wipe it out.
A block of constituencies across the middle and north of England that had previously been solid Labour working class heartlands switched to voting for Boris Johnson's Conservatives. In some cases, it was the first time the Tories had ever taken the seat. And in a lot of cases, it was the first time lifelong Labour voters had voted for the other side. Here's Tim Bale again.
By 2019, it's very difficult to see class as being a driving factor in most people's vote. Class voting seems to have completely disappeared. And that is in part because a lot more middle class people are voting Labour and Liberal Democrats, but it's also because a lot more working class people are voting Conservative. And I think, there was clearly an attempt on the part of the Conservatives to corral those people into their electoral coalition, not necessarily on the basis of economic policies, but generally speaking on the basis, as if you like, a cultural appeal to working class voters.
Johnson, an Eton-educated posh boy, was lauded as some kind of Pied Piper of the working classes. He'd wooed England's post-industrial communities to the party of the aristocracy.
If you look at surveys of working class voters, they are still to the left of most voters when it comes to the economy and public services, but they are more authoritarian, if you like, than most voters when it comes to cultural issues, obviously particularly immigration and to some extent Brexit as well. So I think what Boris Johnson was trying to do was to launch a cultural appeal to working class voters and to some extent an appeal based on a promise, having got Brexit done, to expand public services once again, and obviously levelling up was to a certain extent an attempt to appeal to, that more kind of leftist feeling among working class voters. So I think Boris Johnson was consciously doing that, or at least those around him were consciously doing that.
The fall of the Red Wall was really part of a trend that had been happening for several decades. In 2019, some working class voters did move away from Labour towards the Conservatives, but they didn't move as a class group.
We shouldn't underestimate the kind of power of the Get Brexit Done slogan.
That's Paula Surridge. She's Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Bristol. She's the reference for political surveys.
Those that voted for Brexit wanted Brexit done, but there were also, by that point, a lot of what we might think of as kind of soft Remainers. So people who weren't campaigning for second referendums, who just actually wanted Brexit done so that they could talk about other things, so that they could talk about what was happening to public services, what was happening to high streets and so on. So it was a really, really powerful slogan because it brought this coalition together of people that absolutely voted for Brexit and wanted Brexit done, but also people who were just a bit tired of talking about Brexit.
So what we really saw was not really some great class realignment where the working classes suddenly decided to vote Conservative. It was a lot of people wanting an end to something that had happened in 2016.
Yeah, and people whose feelings were that their communities had really declined, empty high streets, what we might consider low-level antisocial behaviour, but which makes people's lives miserable. All those kind of things that people wanted to see change. And some of them had voted for Brexit because they thought that might bring that change. And then in 2019, they voted Conservative because they thought that might bring that change.
If it felt like a flocking of the working class to the Conservatives, it's because election strategists were tapping into our very British tendency to see class everywhere.
People in Britain understand politics in class terms. After the 2019 election, we did focus groups in what at that time were called the Red Wall seats. And these class-based images of politics came through in the way that people talked about politics. They would talk about people who were just out for themselves, wealthy people. They would use the language of class to talk about the different parties. And they would use the language of class to talk about what had happened in 2019. So I think that's left politics in Britain still deeply coloured by class, even if actually the straight up relationship between the individual parties and particular classes has broken down to a certain extent.
And you know what else was messy in terms of class and voting?
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
Brexit. We often hear that the Brexit vote was a revolt by the working class against the elite, especially from its chief architect, Nigel Farage, now leader of the Reform Party.
And I think it was the old Labour vote that came to us, and we campaigned as hard as we could in those areas.
So if we look at how demographics connect with Brexit vote, class is not the most important factor. Education is a stronger predictor of Brexit vote than class, with those with degree or higher level education more likely to vote Remain than those with lower level qualifications. So the middle class in Britain is bigger than the working class in Britain. So if you take both the Remain vote and the Leave vote, there are more middle class voters in both because they're a bigger proportion of the population. But if you take an individual middle class or working class voter, the working class voter is more likely to have voted for Brexit than the middle class voter. So you can move the data around to make both arguments.
So does Brexit tell us anything about class and politics?
If we look at party identity, so whether or not people feel attached to a party, we can see a real step change in the people saying that they don't feel attached to a political party between 2014 and 2017. So what Brexit does is it makes people think about two connections to parties: their connection on whether or not they want to see greater redistribution of wealth, more funding for public services, those kinds of issues. And then it puts alongside them these issues around tolerance, law and order. We could potentially throw immigration into that. And so people then have got two different ways of assessing which party best represents their interests. And that creates this additional volatility, and it creates a lot of swing voters, many of whom are working class, who want to see left-leaning economic policies, redistribution, funding for public services and so on, but want to see, sometimes we talk about it as social conservative, sometimes we talk about it as authoritarian, but want to see those policies around immigration, around stronger sentencing, policing and so on, more towards the right. So then who do they vote for? Who represents those issues?
I've never heard it put in such good terms. I feel like I suddenly understand things so much better. If you like this podcast, why not listen to What's Wrong with Democracy, a new weekly podcast from Tortoise Media in partnership with Open Society Foundations. Join political scientist Ben Ansell and guests from the world of politics as they explore the issues affecting democracies both near and far, and whether our fractured body politic can be put back together. Search for What's Wrong with Democracy wherever you listen to your podcasts, and follow the feed to make sure you don't miss an episode. So, during Brexit and the 2019 election, the Conservatives didn't really become the party of the working classes, but the class rhetoric was very much there. Our class instincts were readily triggered. What about 2024?
We did it! A changed Labour Party, ready to serve our country, ready to restore Britain to the service of working people.
For the first time in 14 years, Labour, a party originally set up to represent working people, was back in power. John Curtis again.
Labour thought to have any chance of being able to win that they would need to have to particularly reconnect with working class voters, and also, by the way, those who had voted Leave.
Did they manage? The full analysis of the 2024 vote is still ongoing, but the one thing that we do already know about the election was that turnout was one of the lowest in history, at just 60%.
The politics of Westminster and the politics of the electorate have never been further apart. I mean, the outcome of the 2024 election was the most disproportionate ever. But in particular, the way it stands out is that we have a government with 412 seats, dominates the House of Commons, majority of 170 odd, on 35% of the vote in a low turnout election. No previous government has got an overall majority of any kind on less than 35% of the vote.
In other words, very few people of any class voted in 2024. If no one turned out, then it's fairly obvious that the working class didn't flock back to Labour.
So it looks as though, at least so far as Conservative and Labour is concerned, that actually the class division has not re-emerged, despite the fact that Labour in particular were hoping to reconnect with working class voters. Now, that doesn't mean to say there aren't still some differences. Which party's support is now most concentrated amongst the middle class? It's the Liberal Democrats. They've always tended to be somewhat popular amongst middle class voters than working class voters. But again, because Liberal Democrats have always tended to appeal to social liberal voters, the party whose vote is most clearly structured in the opposite direction, well, of course, it's Reform, whose support, according to these post-election polls, was around twice as high amongst those in working class jobs as it was amongst those in middle class jobs.
If there's one thing that shows that class has not left our lives and politics, it's how badly we want to try to understand everything in class terms. A bit after the election, I was lurking on X, formerly Twitter, and ran into some of Paula Surridge's tweets about a purported electoral strategy from the Liberal Democrats. I saw an exchange that you had about Gales. Are you right?
Yeah, it's fine.
Could you maybe explain the Gales phenomenon in electoral terms?
So people have correlated all sorts of things with Brexit vote, party vote, and so on. We can come specifically to Gales in a minute, but I've seen stuff on Pret, which was done just after Brexit, whether or not a constituency had a Pret in it. I've seen stuff which looked at kind of which was the most prevalent takeaway type to show that where fish and chips was the most prevalent, the Brexit vote was higher. I've seen stuff on pubs. You know, people do this all the time. And our electoral geography lends itself to it because you only build things for affluent people in places where affluent people live. There's no point building something that costs a lot to go to where people don't have the money to go to it.
And then there was Gales. It was said that the Liberal Democrats were pursuing a Gales-based electoral strategy. If you were in a constituency that was home to a branch of the popular, and some might say slightly bougie, bakery chain, you could expect to see Lib Dem canvassers in your neighbourhood looking to mop up middle-class votes.
Basically, it's one of those kind of coincidences that there happen to be lots of Gales in London and the southeast of England, because that's where they started and spread out to. And there happen to be lots of Liberal Democrat target seats in the southeast of England. The idea that the two go together just seems to me to be, it's kind of one of those silly season stories almost, you know?
Yeah. Again, we see that class is not an electoral strategy, but something else. The myth of the Gales strategy shows that we just can't help ourselves.
I think it really speaks to the way in which British people love to talk about class without talking about class.
Exactly
that.
And our new government sees it too. Geoffrey Evans at Oxford again.
We have a Prime Minister who probably has the strongest working class credentials than any national leader for a very long time. His deputy, Angela Rayner, is very open about her working class identity.
And she also experienced being working class as an adult to some degree, unlike the others who had all went A-levels and universities. So yeah, she's like the modern day John Prescott, but actually more credible and more high profile.
What's the difference between someone like Keir Starmer, who was born in a working class and family and brought up in a working class community, but has since gone on to have to be a lawyer and to run the Crown Prosecution Service, compared to Angela Rayner, who's come up through the unions? What's the difference?
I mean, you've got your memories of childhood, but you're a successful child, aren't you? You've left school and become a superstar, successful director of public prosecutions, etc. Angela Rayner will have experienced a bit more of what it's like to be an adult in the modern age, not just sort of, fond memories of dad working as a toolmaker or something. She does at least, for some people, give the credibility of actually being authentically experiencing some of the stuff that they have done. And I think that's why it's actually important when people who've gone through trade unions as adults go into politics, they're actually representing people directly from a workplace environment quite often, at least they used to. And so it's not just a sort of a memory of childhood.
In Angela Rayner, the UK now has a Deputy Prime Minister who grew up on a council estate, left school at 16, pregnant, and became a care worker. She speaks proudly of her background and how it informs her ability to represent the country.
I loved the people I cared for, but it was tough at times. I started on casual terms and I wasn't paid for travel. Insecurity at work is the daily reality for so many. Far too many people across our country know that the world of work isn't working for them.
So, if we see everything in class terms and have a working class Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, depending on how you like to measure these things, why does it all feel so unresolved? Why didn't the working class vote return to Labour in 2024? To win the next election, many Labour strategists would like to know. And to figure it out, we're heading back into the past.
Margaret Thatcher said that her greatest achievement was Tony Blair. The Thatcher years created a different sort of Labour Party. But in the Labour narrative, he is now something of a villain for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which being, as far as class is concerned, that he was insufficiently concerned with traditional Labour values and traditional Labour policies, and much too concerned with appeasing the traditional enemies of the party who eventually, they would say, consumed him.
That's next time on Know Your Place from the Conversation Documentaries.
You've been listening to the first episode of Know Your Place, What Happened to Class in British Politics from the Conversation Documentaries podcast. It's supported by the National Centre for Social Research, and you can subscribe to the show by searching for Know Your Place, the Conversation Documentaries, wherever you listen to your podcasts. This episode was written by Laura Hood and our producer Anouk Millet, who also mixed the series. I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer of The Conversation Weekly, and this episode was mixed by Michelle Macklem. If you'd like to get in touch with The Conversation about our podcasts, do email us at podcast@theconversation.com and do sign up for our free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. This podcast is a production of The Conversation. We're a not-for-profit news organisation working with academics to share their knowledge with the general public. If you like what we do, please consider donating to The Conversation by going to donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. Thanks for listening.